What if the faith you were born into is the very chain that binds you? I know that question might feel dangerous, even blasphemous, but I must ask it, because for 24 years, that chain was wrapped around my childhood, my body, and my very soul. It was a chain decorated with verses from the Quran, tightened by the rulings of clerics, and polished by a tradition that saw my gender as a liability. They told me my body was not my own, that my childhood was a currency to be spent by men. By the age of 16, I had been sold twice. By 24, I had known 4 husbands. I am not here for your sympathy. I am here as a witness, to testify that in the deepest darkness, a light can find you, a light that does not see you as property, but as a person. A light so pure, it can shatter chains that have held generations captive. My name is Asha. I was born in Mogadishu, a city of sun-bleached walls and a sea that seemed to promise freedom, but never delivered. The call to prayer was the rhythm of my life, a rhythm I once found comfort in, until I realized its beat was counting down to the day I would be given away. I remember the scent of incense in our home, the vibrant colors of my dirak on Eid, and the feeling of my mother's hands braiding my hair. Those hands that loved me so deeply were the same hands that would one day help prepare me for my first wedding. That is the contradiction that haunted my life, love and betrayal, woven together like the threads of a single fabric. This is the story of how I was sold, not once, but 4 times, in the name of God. And this is the story of how I was found by a love that asked for no price, a love that called me by my real name for the very first time. If you are watching this, and you feel the weight of a chain, however invisible, then this testimony is for you. Do not look away. Your liberation may depend on what you hear next. My earliest memories are a tapestry of light and sound. The brilliant Mogadishu sun, so bright it made the white buildings of Hamarwain look like they were glowing from within. The constant, rhythmic crash of the Indian Ocean against the coastline, a sound so persistent it became the heartbeat of my childhood. And the calls to prayer. 5 times a day, the voice would echo from the minarets, a hauntingly beautiful melody that wrapped around the city, pulling everyone to their knees. I remember sitting on the cool, polished floor of our home, watching my mother, Fadumo, as she prayed. Her back was straight, her movements graceful and sure. There was a peace on her face in those moments, a deep and settled certainty that I desperately wanted for myself. She would teach me the verses, her voice soft and patient. She told me that Allah was merciful, that He had a plan for each of us. I believed her with all my heart. My faith was as natural to me as breathing, a warm blanket of belonging and purpose. Our home was filled with love, but it was a love with defined borders. My father, Ahmed, was a kind but distant figure. His laughter was a rare and wonderful sound, like sudden rain in the dry season. He would pat my head and call me his little star, but his eyes held more ambition for my brothers, Ibrahim and Omar. They were sent to the best school in the district, their satchels filled with books about the world. My classroom was the kitchen, my lessons learning to cook the perfect canjero, to clean a house until it shone, to be a good wife. I didn't question it, not at first. This was the way of things. The world of men was outside, in the streets and markets and mosques. The world of women was inside, within the walls of our home, a world of preparation and waiting. I would watch my brothers leave each morning, a knot of something I didn't yet recognize as envy tightening in my stomach. They were being prepared for life. I was being prepared for a man. Sometimes, I would sneak a glance at my father's small television. I saw glimpses of another world. Girls my age, in London and Toronto, carrying skateboards and wearing backpacks, their faces open and laughing, their futures a map of their own choosing. It felt like watching a fantastical story. a dream so far removed from my reality that it might as well have been on the moon. My map was already drawn, its borders set by tradition and faith. I didn't know then how soon those borders would begin to close in around me. The first crack in my innocent world appeared on a day that had begun like any other. The air was hot and still, heavy with the scent of frankincense. My father came home with a man I knew as Uncle Farah. He was a friend of my father's from the market, a wealthy trader with a loud laugh and eyes that felt like they were weighing everything they saw. I was 12 years old. I served them sweet, spiced tea, as I had been taught. I kept my eyes downcast, my movements modest, but I felt Uncle Farah's gaze follow me around the room. It was not a look of familial affection. It was the look a man gives to a piece of furniture he is considering purchasing. Later that night, I heard the murmurs from the other room. My mother's voice, low and hesitant. My father's, firm and final. The word I caught, the word that turned my blood to ice, was Gabadis, my daughter. A transaction had been initiated. The currency was me. The days that followed were a blur of strange, terrifying preparations. My mother's hands, which had always braided my hair with such tenderness, now held them down to apply intricate henna patterns. The dark red paste felt like a chain being painted onto my skin. Women from the neighborhood came, their voices a chorus of congratulations that sounded like mourning to my ears. They told me I was becoming a woman, that I was blessed to be chosen by a man of such standing. I felt like a goat being fattened for a feast, surrounded by well-wishers who were admiring how plump I had become. The wedding day arrived. I was draped in a beautiful durak, a gown of brilliant green and gold that felt heavier than any weight I had ever carried. The celebrations were loud. There was music and dancing and so much food. I sat in the center of it all, a silent, smiling doll. I remember locking eyes with my mother across the room. For a fleeting second, the mask of celebration slipped from her face, and I saw a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow in her eyes. Then she looked away, and the moment was gone. It was the first time I understood that she knew. She knew exactly what she was giving me away to, and her powerlessness was a reflection of my own. That night, in a room that was not my own, the man I was told to call my husband came to me. The door clicked shut, and the world as I knew it ended. The teachings of modesty, the value placed on my purity, all of it was torn away in a series of brutal, painful moments. I was not a person. I was an object to be used. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, staring at a crack in the ceiling, trying to disappear into it. I learned the first and most important lesson of my marriage. My body was not a temple. It was a territory to be conquered. My silence was the prize. Life settled into a new, grim routine. I was a servant in a house that was not a home. My days were a cycle of cooking, cleaning, and submission. Uncle Farah, my husband, was not cruel in the way you might imagine. He was indifferent. His needs were commands. My existence was a function. I learned to make myself small, to move through the rooms without making a sound, to become a ghost in my own life. The vibrant, curious girl who once dreamed of the sea was buried deep inside, replaced by a hollowed-out woman who jumped at the sound of her own name. Months turned into a year, then 2. And each month, when I bled, the indifference in my husband's eyes would curdle into disappointment. The pressure mounted. My failure to provide a child, a son, was a dark mark against me. The whispers started again. I was barren. The valuable asset was losing its value. The chain that bound me was beginning to loosen, not through any act of my own, but because I had failed in my only purpose. I was returned to my father's house like defective goods, the chain of my faith now weighted with the heavy lock of shame. I was 14 years old, and my life was already over, or so I thought. This was only the beginning of the cycle. Returning to my father's house was not a homecoming, it was a demotion. The shame was a physical presence, a cloak I could not remove. My mother's embraces were tighter, laced with a guilt she could never voice. My father could barely look at me. I was a living reminder of a failed business arrangement. The silence in our home was no longer peaceful, it was accusatory. I had been weighed, measured, and found lacking. In their eyes, and in my own, my value had plummeted. For a few months, I was allowed to exist in this limbo. I resumed my chores, but the hope had been drained from them. The lessons on how to run a household were no longer for my future home, but for my next masters. I felt like a book that had been badly written, waiting to be edited, or perhaps thrown away entirely. The faith that had once been my comfort now felt like a cage. I would still pray, but the words felt empty on my lips. I was following the motions of a ritual that had betrayed me. Where was the mercy I had been promised? Where was the plan? The answer came sooner than I feared. The whispers started again, this time with a new name, Kofi. A Somali businessman based in Kismayo, a man known for his sharp deals and even sharper temper. He was looking for a young wife, someone he could mold, someone without the baggage of a previous long-term union. My father saw an opportunity to offload a damaged asset. My brief time as a wife, though fruitless, had at least proven I was obedient. That was a quality men like Kofi valued. The negotiation was swift. I was not consulted. I was told. The memory of my mother braiding my hair for the second time is a wound that has never fully healed. Her tears fell silently, disappearing into my hair. She didn't speak. There were no words left. The henna ceremony felt like a mockery. The same patterns, the same songs, for a different man, a different prison. This time, there was no pretense of celebration. It was a somber, functional affair. I was being transferred. The journey to Kismayo was long and dusty. My new husband, Kofi, barely spoke to me. His presence was like a storm cloud, filled with a quiet, unpredictable energy. He was a large man, with hands that looked like they could crush stone. His eyes were constantly calculating, assessing. The home he brought me to was larger than Uncle Farah's, but it was cold. There were no personal touches, no photographs. It was a house, not a home, a reflection of the man who owned it. The first night was a relapse into nightmare. The pain was familiar, but the fear was different. With Uncle Farah, it was the fear of the unknown. With Kofi, it was the fear of the known and the dread of something worse. He was not indifferent, he was demanding. My silence was not a prize, it was an expectation. Any hesitation, any flicker of emotion on my face was met with a sharp word or a crushing grip on my arm. He didn't want a wife, he wanted a puppet, and his hands were always on the strings. Life under Kofi's roof was a lesson in constant vigilance. The air was thick with the threat of his anger. I learned to read the set of his shoulders, the tone of his voice. A misplaced spice in his dinner could mean a night of screaming. A floor not polished to a mirror shine could mean going without food. The hollowed-out feeling from my first marriage was now filled with a constant, buzzing anxiety. I was not a ghost here. I was a prisoner, and the warden took pleasure in reminding me of the bars. The violence escalated slowly, like a pot coming to a boil. A sharp grip on my arm became a shove. A shove became a slap that left my ear ringing. I learned to apply makeup not for beauty, but to conceal the faint bruises on my cheekbone, the swelling around my eye. I became an expert in lies, telling the women at the market I had walked into a door that I was clumsy. They would nod, their eyes full of a knowing pity that offered no solace, only shame. My world shrank to the size of that house, every corner of it a potential trigger for his rage. The isolation was absolute. I had no friends, no confidants. The other wives in the neighborhood moved in their own circles of quiet suffering, but we never spoke of it. It was our shared, unspoken burden. My only connection to the girl I used to be was a small, hidden photo of my mother and me, taken before my first marriage. I would look at it in secret, tracing the lines of her face, my own face so young and unmarked by fear. It was a dangerous artifact, a spark of memory that could ignite my despair. One afternoon, he came home in a fury over a business deal that had fallen through. I had prepared his favorite meal, a complex lamb stew, but the rice was, in his words, a minute overcooked. He didn't shout, he just looked at me, his eyes dead and cold. Then, he picked up the pot of stew and threw it against the wall next to my head. The hot, greasy liquid splattered across my face and neck. The clay pot shattered, and a piece of it cut my arm. In that moment, something inside me broke. Not in a quiet, surrendering way, but in a sharp, definitive snap. That night, as he slept soundly beside me, I made a decision. I would run. It was a suicidal thought. A woman alone in Kismayo at night had no protection, no rights. But the risk of death felt preferable to the certainty of this slow, living death. I waited until his breathing was deep and steady. Then I slipped out of bed. I took nothing but that small photo and the few shillings I had managed to hide from the grocery money. I didn't even put on my proper shoes. I just ran. The night air was cool and terrifying. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a potential pursuer. I ran towards what I thought was the road out of the city, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't get far. A neighbor, a man loyal to Kofi, saw me. He didn't hurt me. He just grabbed me, his grip firm, and dragged me back to the house I had just escaped. The look on Kofi's face when he answered the door was not one of anger, but of pure, cold triumph. He had proven his total ownership. The punishment was severe. I was not allowed to leave the house for a month. My food was brought to me. I was a ghost again, but this time, I was in solitary confinement. When my family was finally informed, my father's response was not one of rescue. He was furious that I had shamed him, that I had dared to challenge the authority of my husband. My mother's voice on the phone was a broken whisper, pleading with me to be obedient, to endure. There was no safe harbor. The system of family, faith, and law had all conspired to keep me in my cage. I was completely, utterly alone. Soon after, the annulment came. Kofi declared me unruly and defiant. I was once again returned to my father, my value now virtually non-existent. I was damaged goods, a problem to be solved. The solution came in the form of a third proposal, from an elderly, sickly man in Garaway. It was not a marriage, it was a hospice assignment. I was to be his nurse until he died, a widow in waiting. It was the final transaction of my childhood, a quiet, practical disposal of a problem. I went without a fight. There was no fight left in me. My third marriage was not a marriage. It was a waiting period for a death that was already in the room. The man I was given to, Abdurrahman, was a distant relative, old and withered by a sickness that hollowed out his cheeks and made his breath rattle in his chest. His house in Garowe was a tomb, silent and smelling of medicine and decay. My purpose was simple: to keep him clean, to prepare his food, to ensure he did not die alone. There was no pretense of consummation. There was no threat of violence. I was a hired caretaker, except my payment was the title of wife, a title that felt more like a shroud. I would spend my days moving between the kitchen and his bedroom, listening to the slow, labored sound of his breathing. It was a strange, suspended animation. The constant fear I had lived with under Kofi was gone, replaced by a profound, echoing emptiness. I was not being hurt, but I was not living either. I was just waiting. In that silence, My mind had nowhere to go but inward. The thoughts I had suppressed for years began to surface, ugly and demanding. I would look at Abdurrahman, his body a shell, and wonder if this was the ultimate end for all women like me. To be used until we were used up, and then assigned to watch over another's death until our own arrived. Where was Allah in this? Where was the justice, the mercy I recited in my prayers? The prayers had become a hollow habit, words spoken into a void that gave nothing back. My faith was now a skeleton, picked clean of any comfort, leaving only the bare bones of duty and fear. I was a widow at 20. The news was delivered to me by a neighbor with a solemn nod. There was a brief ceremony, somber and respectful. I had performed my final duty. I was now a widow, a woman who had fulfilled her purpose by outliving her husband. This status carried a strange, new kind of weight. I was no longer a young girl to be bartered, but I was not free. I was returned to my father's house once more, this time with the label widow attached to me like a permanent brand. The atmosphere at home was different now. My father was older, his ambitions tempered. He saw me not as an asset to be traded, but as a burden to be managed. My mother's guilt had calcified into a quiet sadness that filled the spaces between us. I was a ghost in my childhood home, a living reminder of failed transactions and a diminishing bloodline. The world outside was changing, but within those walls, I was frozen in time, a relic of my own past. It was during this stagnant period that I first heard the whispers of the new law. It started as a rumor on the radio, a fragment of a news bulletin, a proposal to ban child marriage in Somalia. At first, I didn't believe it. It seemed impossible, like a rumor of rain in a perpetual drought. But the whispers grew louder. Women at the market spoke of it in hushed, hopeful tones. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something I thought had died. A faint, fragile ember of hope. Maybe the world was changing. Maybe the system that had sold me, that had broken me, was being challenged. This was not about me, I knew that. I was already ruined. But for the little girls, for the 12-year-olds who were still playing with dolls, unaware of the negotiations happening over their heads, for them, this law was a shield. It was a promise that their childhoods would not be stolen like mine had been. I found myself clinging to this news, listening to every broadcast, praying to a God I was no longer sure listened, that this time, things would be different. This time, justice would win. That flicker of hope became a small, steady flame. I would find excuses to linger near shops with televisions, my heart pounding as I watched the debates in the halls of government. I saw women activists, brave and articulate, speaking with a fire I envied. They used words I had never heard before. Human rights, bodily autonomy, the sanctity of childhood. These concepts felt like cool water on a parched tongue. For the first time, my suffering was being given a name that wasn't God's will or tradition. It was being called what it was, injustice. I dared to imagine a different Somalia. A country where my story would be impossible, where a father's love for his daughter would outweigh her value in camels or shillings. This wasn't just politics. It felt like the beginning of a spiritual awakening. If our laws could reflect the inherent value of a child, then perhaps the God I had been taught about, the one of pure mercy, was real after all. My prayers changed. They were no longer rote recitations, but desperate, personal pleas. Please, I would whisper into the night, let this pass. Let it be true. The day the provisional law was announced, I wept. They were tears of relief, of vindication. It felt like a giant, invisible hand had reached down and placed a shield over every little girl in my country. I allowed myself to believe that my own suffering had not been in vain, that it was part of a larger story of progress. I looked at my mother, and for the first time, I saw a genuine smile touch her eyes. Maybe her granddaughters would live in a different world. But that world lasted for less than a day. The backlash was swift and violent. The very next day, the images flooded the television. Mass protests, not of grateful women, but of men. Thousands of them, led by clerics with loudspeakers, their faces contorted in anger. They chanted that the law was un-Islamic, a Western poison, a violation of divine law. They argued that it was a man's right to marry his daughter when he saw fit. They framed our protection as their oppression. I stood frozen in front of that screen, my body turning to ice. I watched as the government, cowed by the mob, capitulated. The shield was shattered before it could even be raised. The law was overturned, just like that. The announcement was a cold, bureaucratic statement that felt like a physical blow. It sucked the air from my lungs. The ember of hope wasn't just extinguished, it was crushed under the heel of 1,000 men. The faith I had been tentatively trying to rebuild collapsed into a pile of ash and ruin. This was not just a political defeat, it was a divine verdict. The system, the men, the clerics, the government, and the God they claimed to speak for had all looked at the broken bodies of little girls and given a collective, resounding approval. I fell to my knees on the floor of that room. But I did not pray. I was empty. The connection was severed. The God of my fathers had spoken, and his message was clear. I was not a person. I was property, and the law of the land and the law of heaven would forever protect my owners, not me. In that moment of absolute despair, something new was born. Not hope, but a final, silent, and complete renunciation. The chain was still there, but I was no longer just pulling against it. I was now looking for a tool to break it. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the tool would not be found in the faith of my birth. The silence in our home after the law was overturned was heavier than any I had known. It was the silence of finality. My father would not look at me. My mother moved through the rooms like a ghost herself. I was 22 years old, a 3 times divorced widow, and the living embodiment of a failed investment and a shattered hope. I was a problem with no solution within the borders of Somalia. The solution, when it came, was an escape route, but not to freedom. It was an export. A distant cousin, Abdal, who had moved to Nairobi, was looking for a wife. The proposal was not based on my value as a woman, but on my utility. He needed a connection to Somalia for his business, and a wife would help secure his legal status. I was a paperwork facilitator, a living document. My father agreed immediately. It was a way to send the problem away, to make it someone else's burden. There was no ceremony this time, no henna, no celebration. It was a transaction conducted over the phone, followed by a long, silent car journey across the border. I felt no fear, no anticipation. I was numb, a package being delivered to a new address. Nairobi, was a shock to the system. A bustling, chaotic neighborhood known as Little Mogadishu. The sounds, the smells, the crowds. It was overwhelming after the quiet despair of my father's house. But the chaos was outside. Inside Abdal's small apartment, the same old silence waited for me. Abdal was a ghost of a man, not cruel, not kind. He was absent. He saw me as a piece of furniture that could also cook and clean. He spent his days at his shop, his nights watching television or on his phone. He showed no interest in me as a person. There were no demands, no violence, no prayers required. For the first time, I was in a marriage that asked nothing of my soul, because my husband did not believe I had one. At first, this indifference felt like a reprieve. The constant anxiety I had lived with for years began to slowly ease. I could breathe without calculating the cost of each breath. I started to venture outside during the day, walking the vibrant, crowded streets of Eastleigh. I saw Somali women running their own market stalls, laughing with friends, moving with a confidence I had never known. I saw a world where women existed outside of the authority of a husband. It was confusing and terrifying and deeply alluring. I began to frequent a small library run by a Christian charity. At first, I went just for the quiet, for a place to sit that wasn't that silent apartment. I would look at the books, their titles in English and Swahili, worlds of knowledge I could not access. But then, I saw the computers, and with a trembling hand, I did something I had never done before. I opened a browser and I searched. I typed the words that had been burning a hole in my soul since the law was overturned. Is there a God who loves women? The results flooded the screen. Articles, videos, testimonies. And amidst them, I saw a face. A woman from Saudi Arabia. Her story not so different from my own. She spoke of a man named Jesus, a man who spoke to a woman with 5 husbands, who offered her living water. My heart stopped. 5 husbands. I had 4. The coincidence felt like a lightning strike. I clicked on the video, my hands shaking. I had to know. Who was this man who saw the women everyone else used and discarded? I put on the headphones, the world of the noisy library fading away. The woman on the screen spoke with a calm certainty that captivated me. She talked about this Jesus not as a distant, judgmental prophet, but as a friend, a liberator. She spoke of his encounter with the woman at the well, a Samaritan who had had 5 husbands. Jesus knew her entire story, every shameful detail, and he did not condemn her. He offered her a water that would forever quench her thirst. He saw her, truly saw her, and in that seeing, she was made whole. Tears began to stream down my face, silently, uncontrollably. I felt as if she was speaking directly to me, across continents and cultures, as if she had reached into my chest and was reading from the scroll of my life. I was that woman at the well. I had drawn water for 4 different husbands. I knew the shame of being passed from man to man. And here was this figure, this Jesus, who knew it all, and instead of casting a stone, he was offering a gift. I spent days in that library, consumed. I read the Gospel of John on the screen, my eyes devouring the words. I read about the woman caught in adultery, the men ready to stone her, and Jesus saying, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." I read about him healing the sick, touching the untouchables, praising the faith of outsiders. This was not the God of my childhood. This was not a God who sanctioned the selling of little girls. This was a God who stood between the victim and her accusers. This was a God who valued the outcast. One afternoon, sitting at that computer, a profound quiet settled over my spirit. The noise of Eastleigh, the memory of Abdali's indifference, the echoes of Kofi's rage, it all faded into a distant hum. I read the words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." It was as if those words were a key, and they turned a lock deep inside my soul I didn't even know existed. The chains did not break with a loud clang. They simply dissolved. A warmth spread through my chest, a feeling of being utterly and completely loved, not for what I could do or produce, but simply for being Asha. In that moment, I did not hear a voice. I knew a presence. It was a consciousness, vast and loving, filling that small, dusty library corner. And the message was not in Arabic or Somali or English, but was implanted directly into my understanding. You are mine. You were never their property. You are my beloved daughter. I put my head down on the desk and sobbed. Not the silent tears of despair, but great, heaving sobs of release. It was the cry of a child who had been lost in a storm and had finally found her way home. The weight of a lifetime of shame, of being barren, unruly, defiant, and used goods, was lifted off me all at once. I was clean, I was new, I was free. I walked out of that library a different person. Abdal was waiting at the apartment, but he felt like a character from a story I had finished reading. the world looked different. The colors were brighter, the air was sweeter. I had encountered a love that asked for no price. A love that had, in fact, already paid the price for me. I was 23 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was not a wife, not a widow, not a daughter for sale. I was a child of God, and no one could ever take that from me. The freedom I felt was terrifying. It was a vast, open sky after a lifetime in a windowless room. I had no map for this new territory. My first instinct was fear. Was this a trick? A test from Allah? Would lightning strike me for these feelings? I walked back to Abdal's apartment, my mind reeling. The world looked the same, but I was fundamentally different, and I was certain everyone could see it. Nothing had changed in the apartment. Abdal was watching television, barely glancing up as I entered. But everything had changed in me. The silence between us was no longer oppressive. It was insignificant. I was a citizen of a different kingdom now, and his indifference could not touch the core of who I was. That night, I lay in bed, the words from the Gospel of John echoing in my mind. "You are my beloved daughter." I repeated it like a mantra, a shield against the old voices of shame that tried to whisper back. The next day, I returned to the library. It had become my sanctuary. This time, I sought out the Kenyan woman who ran it, Grace. Her name felt like a sign. I approached her, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to say. "How do you explain that you think you've met the Messiah in a computer lab?" I simply asked. "Can you tell me more about Jesus?" She didn't look surprised. She just smiled. A warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She didn't launch into a sermon. She simply invited me to sit with her. She asked about my story. And for the first time, I told it. I told her about Mogadishu, about the 4 husbands, about the overturned law. I spoke of the emptiness, the despair. She listened, not with pity, but with a deep, compassionate understanding. She didn't interrupt. She just let the poison flow out of me. When I finished, she placed her hand over mine. "Asha," she said, her voice steady and soft. "What you described, that is not the heart of God. That is the heart of broken men using God's name." She then opened a physical Bible, its pages worn and soft. She read to me from the beginning. Not rules, not laws, but a story. A story of creation, of a God who walked with humanity in a garden, who called them very good. She spoke of a rupture, a separation, and a long, patient plan to bring his children back home. This was a narrative I had never heard. My Islam was about submission to an unknowable, distant will. This was about a father searching for his lost children. It was about relationship. The concept was so foreign, so beautiful. It felt like learning a new primary color. I started meeting with Grace regularly. She gave me a simple Swahili Bible. I would read it in the library, the words slowly dismantling the fortress of fear I had lived in for so long. I learned about grace. A gift, not a wage. Something you could not earn, and therefore, something you could not lose. This was the antithesis of my entire life's experience, where my value was always conditional, always on the verge of being revoked. Yet, a war raged inside me. The conditioning of a lifetime is a powerful enemy. What about my family? I would be dead to them. What about hell? The teachings of eternal fire for apostates were seared into my psyche. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing there was a paradise on the other side, but terrified to jump because the fall, if I was wrong, was eternal. I was caught between 2 realities, and the pull of the old one was a strong, familiar current. The battle in my soul reached its peak one sweltering afternoon. I was reading in the book of Romans, chapter 8. My eyes fell on a verse that seemed to be written in fire. "For you did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, And by him we cry, Abba, Father, Abba. It was an Aramaic word, an intimate, childlike term, like Papa. Not the distant, transactional Allah I had known. The Spirit himself testified with my spirit that I was God's child. The words weren't just ink on a page. They were a key turning in my heart. The fear of hell, the terror of my family's rejection, it all melted away in the face of this one overwhelming truth. I had a father, a good father, and I was his. I looked up at Grace, who was sorting books nearby. My vision was blurred with tears, but my voice was clear and steady for the first time. I want this, I said. I want Jesus. I want to be adopted. Grace's face lit up with a joy that was pure and radiant. She didn't ask if I was sure. She could see that I was. She explained that it was a simple matter of the heart, a prayer of surrender. Right there, surrounded by the quiet whispers of turning pages and the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, I closed my eyes. I didn't need a special prayer. The words came from a place deeper than memory. Jesus, I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope. I believe you are the Son of God. I believe you died for me. And I believe you rose again. Please forgive me. Forgive my sins. I am so tired of carrying them. Come into my life. Be my Lord. Be my Savior. Be my Abba. There was no thunder, no earthquake. But the stillness in that room became holy. The warmth I had felt before returned. But this time it wasn't just a feeling, it was a person. It was as if a missing piece of my own soul had clicked into place. A piece that defied all understanding, a piece I had not known was possible, flooded every cell of my being. The war was over. I was home. A few weeks later, in a small, tucked-away church, I was baptized. The pastor was a kind Kenyan man, and the congregation was a handful of believers from different tribes. As I stepped into the water, I wasn't thinking about my past husbands, or my father, or the overturned law. I was thinking about the woman at the well. I was going under the water as Asha, the used goods, the barren one, the problem. I came up out of the water gasping, not for air, but for the sheer joy of a new life. I was Asha, the beloved daughter. The old was gone. The new had come. I returned to Abdal's apartment that evening, my hair still damp. He looked at me, and for the first time, he seemed to actually see me. You are different, he said, his brow furrowed in confusion. I simply smiled. I am, I replied. He didn't understand. He couldn't. A few months later, he officially divorced me. I was a fourth-time divorcee, a 24-year-old woman with no money and no family. By the world's standards, I was a complete failure. But for the first time, the world's standards no longer applied to me. I was free. And I was about to discover that this freedom came with a cost, and with a purpose. Freedom, I quickly learned, is not a peaceful meadow. It is a battlefield. The first cost came swiftly. With Abdal's divorce, I was utterly alone in Nairobi. I had nowhere to go. Grace, the librarian, took me in. Her small home became my refuge, a tangible example of the love your neighbor teaching she lived by. It was there, in the safety of her kindness, that the whispers started again. But this time, they were not whispers of shame. They were whispers of purpose. The faces of little girls in Somalia began to haunt my dreams, not as victims, but as questions. Will you speak for us? The memory of the overturned law felt like a fresh wound. My freedom felt selfish, a secret to be kept. How could I drink this living water and not offer a cup to those still dying of thirst in the desert? The thought of speaking out terrified me. It meant inviting the storm back into my life. It meant my family would truly, finally, disown me. It meant danger. But the voice inside, the one that called me beloved, was gentle and firm. "Do not be afraid. I am with you." The courage I felt was not my own. It was a solid rock beneath my feet, a foundation I had never known. I realized that my testimony was no longer just my story. It was my weapon. It was the tool to break the chains I had left behind. I decided to make a video, just a simple, spoken testimony. Grace helped me. We used a borrowed camera in her living room. There was no production, no fancy editing. It was just me, looking into the lens, telling the truth. I spoke about the first marriage at 12. I spoke about Kofi's violence. I spoke about the overturned law and the crushing despair. And then, with a peace that still astounds me, I spoke about the woman at the well. I spoke about the library. I spoke about Jesus. I spoke about being a daughter, not property. When I finished, I was shaking. We uploaded it to a small, obscure channel. I thought maybe 100 people would see it. I prepared my heart for the silence, or worse, the backlash. I prayed, not for safety, but for the message to reach just one girl, one mother, one father who might reconsider. The cost of my silence, I now understood, was far greater than the cost of my speech. The silence lasted for a day, then 2. Then, the video found its audience. It started with a trickle of comments. Women, mostly Somali, sharing their own stories in broken English or our native tongue. "This is my life too. Thank you for your courage. I feel seen." Then, the messages became a flood. The video was shared and shared again. It crossed oceans. It was translated. My face, my story, was everywhere. And with the visibility came the price. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Hateful comments, threats, and then the call. It was my brother, Ibrahim. His voice was cold, sharper than any knife. "You are dead to us," he said. "You have shamed our family. You have insulted our prophet. You are no longer Somali. Do not contact us again. Do not use our family name. You are nothing." The line went dead. I collapsed onto the floor of Grace's living room, the phone slipping from my hand. The pain was a physical amputation. I had known it was coming, but the reality of it, the finality, it stole the air from my lungs. I had traded my family for my faith. I had paid for my freedom with every personal connection I had ever known. I wept until I had no tears left. But as I lay there on the floor, a strange thing happened. Through the agony, the presence of my Abba, Father, was closer than ever. It was as if he was holding me, absorbing the shock of the blow. The words from Scripture came back, not as a memory, but as a lifeline. "Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life." I had lost everything, but in losing everything, I had gained the one thing that could never be taken. My identity was no longer in my father's name, my husband's name, or my clan's name. It was sealed in the name of Jesus Christ. And that is why I can stand here today and speak to you. This is my call to you. Do not look away. Do not let my story be just a sad tale you listen to and forget. My story is the story of thousands who are still trapped in silence. If you have heard the truth in my testimony, if you have felt that pull toward a love that liberates, then do not harden your heart. Return to the Gospels. Read the words of Jesus for yourself. See the God who dies for the oppressed, not the God who sanctions their oppression. This is why Echoes of Return exists. To be a voice for the voiceless. To shine a light in the darkest of places. But this mission cannot be done alone. If this testimony has touched you, if you believe that every child deserves a childhood and every woman deserves to be called a person, not property, then you must act. Do not let this truth fade when this video ends. Subscribe to this channel. Share this testimony. Let the algorithms of man be used to spread the eternal truth of heaven. Let my pain become a purpose that echoes across the globe. You have heard my story. Now, I am asking you, become a part of it. Help me turn their silent suffering into a chorus of salvation. The cost of my freedom was everything I had, but the cost of your silence is far, far greater.